Alphonse Capone knew the end was near. The seizures and the mental fog had been worsening for weeks. January 25th, 1947. He woke up sensing this might be his final sunrise, but he went to the Lexington Hotel Cafe anyway. Same booth, same breakfast, because the New York Commission had sent word. They wanted to sit down about narcotics, about the outfit's future, about what happens when the boss passes on. Capone could have stayed at his estate, spent his fading hours in quiet. Instead, he sat across from 3 commission envoys and made a choice: protect his legend or protect his breath. He couldn't do both. He chose Chicago. If you walked through the South Side in the winter of 1947, you'd see something eroding. Not the architecture, not the jazz, not the spirit, but the code. Narcotics were seeping into the boulevards like a toxic mist, and everyone knew the source: the East Coast families, specifically the syndicate controlled by the Commission. For decades, Al Capone had kept that filth at bay. He ran the bootlegging, controlled the speakeasies, kept the truce between the Irish, the Sicilians, and the local gangs. But he had one law that never broke: no powder in Chicago. Not in his territory, not while he was drawing air. But in 1947, Capone wasn't drawing air so easily anymore. He was 48 years old, but his body was ravaged by late-stage paresis. His mind was slipping. The doctors at Cook County Hospital had told him months ago, rest, retreat, enjoy the time you have left. Capone had scoffed. Rest? A boss like him didn't rest. He died governing, and if he was going to go, he was going to go upright, not in some sanitarium bed. The Commission knew this. They'd been observing him, calculating. Frank Costello himself was maneuvering in New York, watching the old guard fade just like Capone. But his faction was still potent, still ravenous, and they saw an opening. Chicago without Al Capone. That was an untapped empire, a gold rush waiting to be seized. The new recruits, the ones who didn't remember when Capone had walked into Johnny Torrio's office, a nobody in 1919, and walked out a king. They thought it would be simple. Just wait for the big fellow to expire, then march in. Set up narcotics trafficking routes, take over the wire services, turn Chicago into another drug hub. But the veteran capos, the ones who remembered, they knew better. They knew Capone was more lethal dying than most men were at their peak. They knew you didn't just waltz into Chicago and claim the crown. Not while Al was lucid. So they decided to attempt diplomacy first. Make him a proposal. Appeal to his greed. After all, he was sick, fading, finished. Surely he'd want to secure his family's dynasty. Surely he'd want to exit with one final score. On January 25th, 1947, 3 men in tailored wool suits climbed into a black Lincoln in Little Italy and drove toward the South Side. Their names were Salvatore Sam Lombardo, Frank the Hammer Russo, Nick Falcone, and a young soldier named Joey Kid Marino. They were armed. They were sanctioned. And Frank Russo was carrying a heavy leather satchel containing $100,000 in cash. They had no concept they were driving toward their own disgrace. The Lexington Hotel Cafe sat near the corner of 22nd Street and Michigan Avenue. It wasn't just a diner. Velvet banquettes worn soft by years of meetings. Marble floors, the scent of cigar smoke, and espresso that had been brewing since dawn. The walls were adorned with portraits of Chicago icons: Big Bill Thompson, King Oliver, Clarence Darrow, and in the center, a framed oil painting of Capone himself, laughing with a cigar in hand. But it was Al's sanctuary. His booth was in the far corner, facing the entrance, always facing the entrance. Old instinct from the days when rivals came through doors, not with treaties, but with Tommy guns. That morning, Capone was solitary. His wife, May, had pleaded with him not to leave. She'd sensed the chill in the wind, the way women who've loved condemned men learn to sense the storm before it breaks. But Capone had kissed her cheek, adjusted his fedora, and told her he'd be back for lunch. He always wore a 3-piece suit, even for coffee. "Class," he'd say. "Respect yourself. Command the room." He ordered his usual biscotti, fresh fruit, poached eggs, espresso. He was reading the Chicago Tribune. scanning a column about the post-war labor strikes, when the cafe door swung open and those three men strode in. The entire room went still. Not the sharp silence of panic, but the gradual hush of recognition as people realized the gravity of the moment. The waitress, a woman named Ethel, who'd been serving at the Lexington for 2 decades, froze mid-pour, her hand trembling, coffee spilling onto the saucer. Everyone in Chicago knew what New York suits in outfit territory meant. Intrusion, the kind that usually ended in a headline. Capone didn't look up from his paper. He took a measured sip of espresso, turned the page with practiced calm, and waited. He'd been anticipating this. Rumors fly fast in the underworld, and he'd known the commission was looking to pivot. He'd known they'd send emissaries eventually. He just hadn't known it would be today. Sam Lombardo approached first. He was the mouthpiece, the diplomat, a capo in his mid-40s who'd earned his stripes running gambling dens in Brooklyn. Frank Russo stayed by the entrance, obstructing it, his eyes sweeping the cafe for trouble. The heavy leather satchel dragged at his arm. Joey, the young one, barely 25, stood behind Sam, trying to look rigid, trying to look like he belonged in the same orbit as Al Capone. "Mr. Capone," Sam said, his tone deferential but steely. "Table open." Capone folded his newspaper slowly, deliberately taking his measure. He looked up at Sam with those heavy, brooding eyes that had stared down federal agents, rival gangs, and judges for 30 years. Eyes that had seen empires rise and never flinched. Then he gestured to the plush seat across from him. "It's a free city." The three men slid into the booth. Ethel approached, her tray rattling slightly, and asked if they desired service. Sam dismissed her without a glance. This wasn't a social visit. This was commerce. For a long minute, nobody spoke. The only sounds in the Lexington cafe were the clink of silverware on china, the low murmur of hushed gossip from other booths, and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Everyone in the room was observing, pretending not to observe. Across the street in a parked Packard, 2 of Capone's lieutenants sat watching through the windshield. Frank Nitti and Jack McGurn. They'd been stationed there since dawn, nursing lukewarm coffee and waiting. Capone never moved without a shadow. Not in 1947. Not with the territory shifting, the young Turks getting reckless, the old treaties dissolving. Sam Lombardo broke the quiet. He nodded to Frank Russo, who stepped forward from his post by the door. Frank heaved the leather satchel onto the table between Capone and Sam, right next to Al's espresso cup, the kind of bag couriers carried, the kind substantial wealth traveled in. The brass buckles snapped open with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent cafe. Inside, stacked precisely in bundles bound with bank bands, were $100 bills, a massive sum. The currency was crisp, tangible, seductive. "Mr. Capone," Sam said, his voice dropping to that conspiratorial pitch partners use when they're about to suggest something illicit but lucrative. "We come with admiration, with a business arrangement that I think you'll find very persuasive." Capone didn't touch the satchel, didn't even glance inside it. His gaze remained fixed on Sam's face. "I'm hearing you." Sam Lombardo leaned in, his hands clasped on the table away from the open bag. "The landscape is shifting, Al. You know this better than any of us. The new generation, they don't care about bootleg liquor anymore. They don't care about speakeasies and wire rooms. They want something potent, something that makes them forget the war, forget the depression, forget the grind. They want narcotics." Capone's expression didn't flicker. He took another sip of espresso, his grip firm. Sam continued, gesturing to the open satchel. "Now, whether you sanction it or not, it's coming to Chicago. The hunger is there. The pipelines are ready. We've got sources in the Mediterranean, in Asia. The product is going to flood the streets. The only question is who governs it." He pointed to the bricks of cash. "This is $100,000 in large notes, untaxed, clean, and it's just the initiation fee. We're offering you 30% of all narcotic revenues in the Midwest. You don't have to lift a finger, don't have to traffic, don't have to take the heat. Just stop barring the door. Let us work. You keep the title. We run the trade. Everybody feasts. The deal? Satchel sat there on the white tablecloth between them, greenbacks visible in tight rows, paper bands holding them in check. Capone could see the portrait on the top bills. Franklin, real capital, a king's ransom, a fortune, enough to ensure May lived like a queen forever, enough to buy silence, invest, build a monument beyond the rackets, enough to die wealthy. But Al Capone had never cared about dying wealthy. Joey, the young one, couldn't suppress his urge to speak. Youth and hubris, Capone mused. A volatile mix. Mr. Capone, with all due respect, you're not in your prime anymore. You've had a legendary run, decades at the helm. That's more than any boss gets. Why resist this? Take the payout? Enjoy your twilight. Live to see your nieces get married. We're going to do this regardless. This is just us showing reverence to the boss. That's when Capone's eyes shifted from Sam to Joey, and the temperature in that booth plummeted. Ethel, refilling coffee cups 3 tables away, felt the chill. The other patrons felt it. Even Sam Lombardo felt it, and he reached out to place a cautioning hand on Joey's forearm. Too late. How old are you, kid? Capone's voice was raspy, conversational. Joey straightened his lapels, trying to project strength, trying not to show that Capone's glare was making his gut twist. 25. 25. Capone nodded slowly as if weighing. You know how old I was when I took over the South Side and told the North Side gang they couldn't breathe without my say-so? Joey didn't answer, didn't know the history. 26. 1 year older than you. You know what Torrio told me? He said I was reckless, said I was a dead man walking, said the establishment would crush me like an insect. That was 1925, 22 years ago. Capone paused. And here I am, still sitting at the head of the table. And Torrio? Torrio retired to Italy after getting shot up on his own front lawn. Died of a heart attack just like the one that's stalking me. He looked back at Sam. Where's Frank Costello right now, Sam? Sam Lombardo shifted in his seat. He's in New York, Al. Managing the commission. You know that. Managing. Capone smiled, but it was a wolf's grin. Funny how that works. We spend our lives seizing territory, and in the end, we're just managing the decline. Sam tried to steer the meeting back on track. Mr. Capone, nobody's challenging you. We know your legacy. We know what you built, but the era turns. The old laws, the old prohibitions, they don't apply. The old laws. Capone's voice was low, but it sliced like a stiletto. You think you're bringing me innovation? You think I haven't seen this filth before? Dope isn't new, Sam. It's been scratching at Chicago's door since the 20s. And every single time I bolted that door shut. You know why? Sam didn't reply. Because I've seen the rot. I watched it decay neighborhoods in New York. I watched it turn solid men into ghosts. And I made a vow to this city that as long as I was the boss, that plague wouldn't flow through my streets. He reached across the table and slammed the satchel shut. The buckle snapped with finality. Then he shoved the bag back toward Sam, sliding it across the linen. The leather scraping sounded like a gavel in the hushed room. I don't want your tribute, and I don't want your junk in my city. Frank Russo spoke up from his stance near the exit, his voice coarser than Sam's. Al, be rational. You can't halt this. You're one man. We're a syndicate. We've got the supply, the politicians, the judges. What do you have? A few old bootleggers and a memory. Capone looked at Frank, then back at Sam, then at young Joey. And for the first time since they'd convened, he laughed. It wasn't a joyous laugh. It wasn't warm. It was the laugh of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it amusing. The laugh of a man who had settled his accounts. Let me tell you something about Chicago, Capone said, his voice steady and resonant, despite the pressure beginning to crush his chest. You think it's just another territory, just another ledger to balance, just another revenue stream? He shook his head slowly. Chicago is a standard for the people who work the stockyards, a standard for the immigrants who came here with nothing and built a skyline, a standard for the kids running these alleys that there's a code, a way of doing things that isn't just about destroying your own blood to make some Don in New York rich. He pointed at the closed satchel. You bring that poison into Chicago, you're not just peddling vice. You're peddling decay. You're selling surrender. You're taking strong men who could be soldiers, earners, captains, and you're turning them into junkies and corpses. Sam Lombardo adjusted his tie nervously. Mr. Capone, we're businessmen. We're not responsible for the vices of the public. Don't dress it up with words like business. Capone's voice didn't rise, but it seemed to vibrate through the mahogany walls. Ethel dropped a teaspoon behind the counter. The clatter rang out like a bell. You're butchers. You sell death. You ruin families. You hollow out the city, and you want me to kiss your ring and help you do it? The agony in his chest was flaring now. Capone could feel it. A constriction, a seizing, like an iron band tightening around his ribs. His left arm was numb. He recognized the Reaper. He'd seen men drop from strokes before. He knew the curtain was falling, but he wasn't finished speaking. Here's my answer to your offer, Capone said, locking eyes with each man. First Sam, then Frank, then young Joey, who couldn't hold the stare, and looked at the floor. You can bring your narcotics to Chicago over my rotting corpse. And even then, the men I've made, the code I've etched into these streets, they'll fight you for every block. You'll never own Chicago. Not the way you own the 5 boroughs. Not while there's one soldier left who remembers who Al Capone was. The pain was blinding now. Sharp. His breath was shallow. But Alphonse Capone had one final decree. 3 words that would be whispered in the outfit for the next 50 years. 3 words that would become his epitaph. He leaned forward, his gaze boring into Sam Lombardo, and rasped, Chicago doesn't kneel. The stroke hit him like a hammer to the temple. Capone's hand flew to his heart, clutching his vest. His espresso cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble, dark liquid spreading across the floor like oil. Ethel screamed from the service station. Sweet Jesus, someone call a doctor. But before anyone could react, the cafe doors burst open with a violent crash. 4 men stormed in. Hard men, Chicago men. Frank Nitti led them, his lean frame cutting through the doorway. Behind him came Jack McGurn, Tony Accardo, and a young enforcer named Sam Giancana, who ran security for the speakeasies. They'd been watching from across the avenue the entire time. They'd seen the New Yorkers enter. They'd been coiled, ready. And when they saw Capone grip his chest through the plate glass, they charged. Nitty's eyes went from Capone gasping for air to the 3 visitors in the booth to the black satchel on the table. What did you do to him? Nitty's voice was pure venom, pure execution. Sam Lombardo went ashen. His hands shot up, palms open, showing he was clean, showing he meant no violence. Nothing. We were just talking. He just seized up. I swear on my mother, we didn't touch him. You brought filth to his table. Nitty stepped closer, his hand sliding inside his coat. You insulted him in his own city, and now he's dying right in front of you. That's when Sam Lombardo understood, and so did Frank Russo, and so did young Joey, whose face had drained of all arrogance. It didn't matter what the medical reality was. It didn't matter that Capone was a dying man with a ravaged brain. What mattered was the optic. What mattered was the narrative. 3 commission rivals sitting across from Al Capone when he collapses in Chicago, with witnesses in a territory that revered him as a king. They'd be cut to pieces before the ambulance siren wailed. Frank Russo was already retreating toward the exit, the satchel still in his grip. Joey's hand twitched toward his shoulder holster, but Nitty caught his wrist in a grip like a vice. You draw that iron, kid, and you'll never leave this zip code. None of you will. They'll be fishing you out of the Chicago River by twilight. Through the haze, through the crushing pressure in his skull, Capone managed to speak. His voice was a faint wheeze, but in the terrified vacuum of the Lexington Cafe, everyone heard it. Let them walk. Nitty looked down at him, confused, furious. Boss, let them walk? Capone's breath was rattling now, every syllable a war. I want them to tell the commission. He looked directly at Sam Lombardo, who was paralyzed in the booth. Tell them Chicago doesn't kneel. Nitti released Joey's wrist. He stepped aside, clearing a lane to the street, but his eyes promised retribution if they ever returned. Sam Lombardo snatched the satchel from the table. Evidence, witness, liability. And the three envoys didn't walk. They scrambled, Frank clutching the bag, Joey and Sam on his heels. Out the door, into the winter air, and into their Lincoln, tires screeching as they tore away. Desperate to escape the South Side. They weren't running from Capone. They were running from the wrath of a city, from the certainty that if Al Capone died with them in the room, they'd be the scapegoats, and the outfit would hunt them down. Behind them in the Lexington Cafe, Ethel was at Capone's side, holding his hand, weeping. Nitti was shouting for the phone. Other patrons were crowding around, some sobbing, some making the sign of the cross. Capone looked up at Ethel and managed a faint smirk, a real Chicago grin, crooked and defiant. "Tell May," he whispered. "Tell her I'm sorry about lunch." Those were his final coherent words. On January 25th, 1947, Al Capone's struggle ended. Minutes after the sit-down with the commission representatives. Minutes after he rejected $100,000. Minutes after he chose code over comfort. He collapsed in his booth at the Lexington, the same spot he'd held court for years. He fell surrounded by his people, by men who feared him, respected him, followed him. He died a sovereign. Unbought, unbent. The private memorial was held days later. Thousands of people lined the streets near the funeral home. The procession stretched for miles down State Street. People who'd never met Capone, people who only knew the headlines, people whose families had been fed by his soup kitchens during the Depression. They all came to mark the end of an era. The commission, predictable as ever, tried to infiltrate after Capone's burial. For months they pushed narcotics into the city, thinking the boss was gone and the seat was vacant. They were mistaken. The old guard, the bootleggers who'd ridden with Torrio and Capone since the 20s, the ward bosses who remembered the rules, the captains who'd learned from watching Al navigate the volatile underworld. They remembered what Capone stood for. They remembered his decree, "Chicago doesn't kneel." But the truth is bitter, and history is unsparing. Capone's death left a void, and power abhors a vacuum. Within a few years, younger bosses who didn't remember Capone's edicts, who hadn't stood in his shadow and learned the difference between being a gangster and being a boss, they did start trafficking narcotics into Chicago in massive volumes. They told themselves it was evolution. They told themselves they were pragmatic. They told themselves they could manage it, could ring fence it, could profit without poisoning the well. They were wrong. The drug epidemic that Capone died resisting arrived anyway. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the neighborhoods suffered, families were fractured, the streets became battlegrounds. The very dystopia Capone had tried to blockade became the status quo. But here's what the history books omit, what the crime stats don't reveal. It was harder because of Al. The commission never fully subjugated Chicago the way they dominated New York or the East Coast. The outfit retained its independence. The city remembered there was a standard, even if they couldn't always uphold it. And when the worst of the wars hit, there were still men in the outfit who remembered Al Capone's last stand. They invoked his name. They reminded the new recruits, once we had a boss who said no. Once we had a king who chose the code over the cash. Once we had a leader who'd rather expire than sell out his city. That memory carried weight. It still carries weight. Sam Lombardo kept that leather satchel for the rest of his life. Never unbuckled it again after that morning. Never laundered the money, never spent a dime. The $100,000 remained inside exactly as it had been bundled that winter day. Same bank bands, same stacks, untouched. He kept it in a floor safe in his home in Queens. And occasionally when young associates would come to him for guidance, for lore, for tales of the golden age, he'd haul out that satchel, open it, and display the cash. "This," he'd say, pointing to the rows of bills, "is what happens when you underestimate a king. This is what happens when you think everyone has a price." Al Capone was dying. We offered him a kingdom, and he chose death rather than take it. He'd snap the bag shut and lock it away. That's respect. That's iron. That's something we don't see anymore. Sam Lombardo died in 1976. His son found the satchel in the safe after the wake. He opened it, saw the cash, still there, still bound, bills brittle with age, and found a note tucked inside. Give this to the Chicago History Museum. It belongs to the city, not to us. Let them know it's the bribe Capone refused, the money that proved he couldn't be bought. SL. The satchel and its contents were allegedly donated anonymously to the Chicago History Museum in 1977. The curators won't officially verify its provenance, but archivists who've worked the vaults will quietly tell you. Somewhere in the collection, there's a cracked leather satchel containing $100,000 in 1947 currency. A monument to the day a dying boss said no. The Lexington Hotel Cafe closed years later. A casualty of urban renewal. Before the demolition crews arrived, a group of South Side locals mounted a small brass plaque on the wall where Capone's booth once stood. It remained there for exactly one afternoon before the walls came down. But a photographer snapped a picture, and that image circulated through the wards, and the inscription was memorized. It read, Alphonse Capone, 1899, 1947, the man who never kneeled. In this spot, he chose the code over his life. Today, if you walk through the old neighborhoods of Chicago, you'll still hear the echoes. Old men in social clubs, playing cards, smoking cigars. They tell stories about the time Capone faced down the feds, about the soup kitchens he ran, about the morning he sat across from the New York Combine and said no with his final breath. The stories aren't always precise. Dates get blurred. Facts merge with myth. But the core remains solid. Once Chicago had a boss who couldn't be purchased. Once a man chose his territory over his tranquility. Once someone showed the underworld that some things weigh more than gold, more than influence, more than survival. That's Al Capone's legacy. Not the violence, not the tax evasion, not the scars. The moment when he had to choose between fading away in comfort or dying for his law. He chose to die upright. And in doing so, he showed Chicago, showed all of us, what real power looks like. Not the power to crush enemies, not the power to amass fortunes, but the power to say no when the world demands a yes. The power to choose the hard path over the easy exit. The power to be a man of his word in a world of liars. On January 25th, 1947, Al Capone's heart stopped. But his decree kept resonating. Chicago doesn't kneel. Not now, not ever. And decades later, those words still hold fire. They still provoke. They still remind us that we have agency, that we are not pawns, that we don't have to accept the terms we are given. We can be like Al. We can stand firm. We can say no. We can choose the code over the compromise, even if it costs us everything. If this story of defiance and unbreakable will move you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that loyalty still counts in a world that's forgotten the rules. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the money or held the line like Capone? Let us know and turn on notifications for more lost histories of the American underworld. On January 25th, 1947, Al Capone's heart stopped beating, but his words kept echoing through the windy city. Chicago doesn't kneel. Not now, not ever. And more than 70 years later, those words still mean something. They still inspire. They still remind us that we have choices, that we have agency, that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can be like Capone in that final moment. We can stand up. We can say no. We can choose principle over survival, even if it costs us everything. If this story of courage and unshakable principle moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that honor still matters in a world that's forgotten what it means. Drop a comment below. Would you have made the same choice Al did? Let us know and turn on notifications for more untold stories of Chicago's greatest legends.